Neanderthal Survival, The True Power of Ancient Humans. Dr. Brennan, your outdated theories about Neanderthal intelligence have no place in this symposium. Security will escort you to the exit. Chairman Morrison, you'll want to hear what I have to say before those earthquake aftershocks bring this entire convention center down on 2,000 people. The room fell silent. Dr. Margaret Brennan stood at the back of the grand ballroom of the Pacific Coast Convention Center, her weathered hands gripping a worn leather briefcase. She was 73 years old, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a simple cardigan over a plain dress, a stark contrast to the sleek suits and designer dresses surrounding her. The International Anthropology Symposium had been her life's work for 40 years, but 3 years ago, the board had forced her into retirement, calling her research romantically outdated, and her focus on Neanderthal cognitive abilities scientifically embarrassing. Now, on October 7, 2025, she had returned uninvited to the very conference she had founded, and the current chairman, Dr. Robert Morrison, a man 30 years her junior with perfectly styled hair and a dismissive smirk, was having her removed. But Margaret wasn't looking at Morrison. She was looking at the ceiling. The ballroom was on the third floor of a modern glass and steel structure built just 5 years ago, designed to be earthquake-resistant. But Margaret had felt the tremor 20 minutes ago, a small one, barely 4.2 on the Richter scale according to the emergency alert on her phone. Everyone else had laughed it off, returned to their champagne and conversations about grant funding. But Margaret had spent 3 years studying ancient human responses to natural disasters, and she had seen something in the building's framework during that tremor that made her blood run cold. The steel support beam near the northwest corner had shifted, just slightly, just enough. Dr. Brennan, Morrison said, his voice dripping with condescension as he approached her, security guards flanking him. You were removed from this organization for refusing to accept modern archaeological methods. Your obsession with primitive human behavior. The building shuddered. Harder this time. Glasses fell from tables. Someone screamed. The chandelier swayed violently overhead, and a deep groaning sound came from somewhere in the structure itself. The sound of metal under stress, of supports beginning to fail. Margaret's voice cut through the rising panic, clear and commanding. Everyone needs to move to the eastern wing immediately, not the exits, the eastern wing. The northwest support has been compromised, and when the next aftershock hits, this entire section will collapse. Morrison's face flushed red. That's absurd. This building was designed by people who never studied how ancient humans survived catastrophic events by reading the smallest environmental signs, Margaret interrupted. She raised her voice to address the crowd. I've spent 50 years studying how Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens survived earthquakes, floods, and volcanic eruptions. They didn't have engineering degrees. They had observation and pattern recognition that kept them alive for hundreds of thousands of years. And right now, every instinct developed over 3 million years of human evolution is telling me that we need to move. Now. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Margaret Brennan had made the decision that would change everything. 3 hours earlier, Margaret had been sitting in her small apartment in Berkeley, California, staring at the invitation she had not received. On her laptop screen was the program for the 45th Annual International Anthropology Symposium, and her name was nowhere to be found. Not in the speaker list, not in the acknowledgments, not even in the historical notes about the conference's founding. They had erased her. Her student, David Chen, sat across from her at the small kitchen table. He was 35, brilliant, and one of the few young anthropologists who still believed in her work. Dr. Brennan, he said softly, maybe it's time to let it go. Margaret looked up at him, and for a moment David saw the fire that had made her legendary in the 1970s and 80s. David, do you know why I dedicated my life to studying Neanderthals? He shook his head. He'd heard pieces of the story, but never the whole thing. In 1962, when I was 10 years old, my father took me to see the Natural History Museum in New York. There was an exhibit Neanderthals depicted as brutish, stupid, barely human. I remember the sign. An evolutionary dead end, inferior to Homo sapiens in every way. Margaret's voice grew quieter. My father was a coal miner in Pennsylvania, 8th grade education. Everyone in our town looked at people like him the same way that museum looked at Neanderthals, as if being different, being physical rather than academic, made you less than human. She stood and walked to her bookshelf, pulling down a photograph. It showed a young Margaret with an older man, both covered in dust, smiling in front of a cave entrance. 20 years later, I found evidence that Neanderthals had sophisticated language, art, and burial rituals. They cared for their disabled. They had culture, David. They were us, just adapted differently. And the more I learned, the more I realized they had something we've lost. What? David asked. They understood how to read the earth, how to survive by paying attention to what the world was telling them. Modern humans, we've become so confident in our technology that we've forgotten how to listen. She set down the photograph. Last month, I was reviewing the geological surveys for the Pacific Coast Convention Center. There's a fault line that wasn't properly accounted for in the construction. The building's been settling unevenly for 3 years. Add in the increased seismic activity we've been having. You think there's going to be an earthquake during the symposium, David said. I think there's going to be an aftershock sequence that will compromise the structural integrity of the northwest wing. And I think 2,000 anthropologists are going to be standing there drinking champagne and dismissing the possibility because a computer model told them the building is safe. David ran his hand through his hair. Even if you're right, Morrison will never let you in. He's the one who led the charge to push you out. Margaret smiled, a small, determined smile that reminded David why he'd chosen her as his mentor. Then I'll have to make an entrance he can't ignore. She had taken a bus to the convention center, carrying only her old leather briefcase and a lifetime of knowledge that the modern world had decided was worthless. She had walked through the main doors at exactly 2:47 p.m. just as the first tremor hit, and she had made her way to the ballroom, watching the building's response, seeing what no one else could see because they had forgotten how to look. Now, back to where we started, Margaret stood in the ballroom with 2,000 people staring at her. The building had stopped shaking, but she could feel it, the tension in the structure, like a rope pulled too tight. They had maybe 10 minutes before the next major aftershock, maybe less. Morrison's face was purple with rage. Security removed this woman immediately, but someone else spoke up. Dr. Sarah Kim, one of the symposium's keynote speakers and a structural engineer turned archaeologist, stepped forward. She was in her 50s, respected, credible. Wait, she said. Let her explain. What did you see, Margaret? Margaret turned to Sarah, grateful. They had worked together decades ago, before Morrison's generation had taken over. The northwest support beam shifted during the first tremor. I watched it. The building's weight distribution is already compromised because of the uneven settling. Look at the hairline cracks in the ceiling near the corner. See how they're spiderwebbing? That's not cosmetic damage. That's load-bearing structure under stress. Sarah pulled out her phone, bringing up the building's schematics. Her face went pale. The original engineer noted concerns about the fault line proximity, but they were overruled. The building's earthquake rating was based on models that assumed even settling. She looked up at Morrison. If she's right about the beam displacement, another tremor, stronger this time. The building groaned, a sound like a living thing in pain. Ceiling tiles began to fall. Someone screamed. The crowd surged toward the exits. No, Margaret's voice cut through the chaos. The exits are in the northwest wing. That's exactly where you don't want to be. The eastern wing is over the most stable part of the foundation. Move there now. Listen to her, Sarah shouted, her engineer's training overriding her social anxiety. She's right, the eastern wing is the safest location. Morrison looked between them, his authority crumbling as the building shook again. This is ridiculous. David Chen had made his way through the crowd. Dr. Morrison, you have a choice. You can protect your ego, or you can protect these people. Dr. Brennan has been right about things like this for 50 years. What have you been right about? The building shuddered violently. A crack appeared in the ceiling, racing across the plaster like lightning. The chandelier in the northwest corner crashed to the floor, missing a group of attendees by feet. Morrison's face went white. The reality of the situation finally penetrated his arrogance. Everyone move to the eastern wing, he shouted, quickly and calmly. Margaret took charge, her voice steady and clear. Don't run. Running causes panic and injury. Walk quickly. If you're near someone elderly or disabled, help them. Form rows, move together. We have time if we don't panic. The crowd responded to her calm authority. Margaret stationed herself near the corridor, directing traffic, making sure no one was left behind. Sarah Kim worked the other side, using her phone to monitor seismic reports. David helped an elderly professor who was using a walker, supporting her arm as they moved. How did you know? Morrison asked quietly as he passed Margaret. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by genuine confusion. The engineers said this building was safe, because I stopped trusting what people told me was safe and started trusting what the earth was telling me, Margaret replied. Neanderthals survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and massive earthquakes without a single piece of technology. They did it by paying attention, by reading the signs. We've lost that. They had just cleared the ballroom when the main aftershock hit. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. The sound was deafening, a roar like a freight train mixed with the screech of tearing metal. The entire northwest corner of the third floor collapsed, the compromised support beam finally giving way under the stress. Concrete and steel crashed down through 3 stories, creating a cascading failure that consumed half the building's west side. The eastern wing shook violently but held. Margaret had been right about the foundation's stability. The 2,000 people pressed together in the Eastern Conference rooms and corridors felt the building move beneath them, heard the destruction happening yards away, but they were safe. When the shaking finally stopped, the silence was absolute. Then someone started crying, then someone else. Then everyone was talking at once, the release of tension and terror overwhelming. Margaret stood by a window, looking at what remained of the building she had founded her conference in decades ago. Half of it was simply gone. If they had stayed in that ballroom, if they had run for the exits as instinct demanded, hundreds would be dead, maybe thousands. Sarah Kim approached her, tears streaming down her face. "You saved them all, every single one of them." Margaret shook her head. "Neanderthals saved them. 300,000 years of human evolution that taught us to watch, to listen, to trust our observations over our assumptions. I just remembered the lessons." The emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the evacuation took hours. One by one, the anthropologists filed out of the building, many of them seeking out Margaret to thank her, to apologize, to simply touch her hand as if she were something precious that had almost been lost. Morrison found her as the sun was setting, standing outside the damaged building. His face was haggard, aged a decade in a single afternoon. "Dr. Brennan, I owe you, I don't even have words." "You owe me nothing," Margaret said quietly. "But you owe those people in there, the Neanderthals, the early Homo sapiens, all the humans who survived long enough to become us, you owe them respect. They weren't stupid. They weren't inferior. They were survivors who understood things we've forgotten in our rush to believe we're superior to everything that came before." Morrison swallowed hard. "Your research, the papers we rejected, I'd like to read them again. Actually read them, not just dismiss them because they challenge the current paradigm." Margaret turned to look at him. "Why?" "Because you just proved that ancient human cognitive abilities, the observation, the pattern recognition, the ability to read environmental signs, those skills saved lives today. Modern technology, engineering degrees, computer models, they all failed. But the knowledge you spent 50 years studying, that succeeded." David Chen joined them, his arm around the elderly professor he had helped evacuate. She was crying softly, repeating thank you over and over. "Dr. Brennan," David said, "the symposium board wants to speak with you. Several of them, actually." Margaret looked at him questioningly. He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in hours. "They want to reinstate you, not just as a member, but as the director of a new research initiative on ancient human survival adaptations. They're calling it the Neanderthal Survival Project." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, a tightness she had been carrying for 3 years without realizing it. "The Neanderthal Survival Project," she repeated softly. "There's more," Sarah Kim said, approaching with her phone. "The video of what happened here has already gone viral. People are calling you a hero, but more importantly, archaeologists from around the world are reaching out, wanting to collaborate on studying ancient survival knowledge. Margaret, you didn't just save lives today. You changed the field." 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in a new conference room, this one carefully selected in a building that had passed her personal inspection of geological stability. The first meeting of the Neanderthal Survival Project brought together 50 researchers from around the world, all focused on understanding and preserving the survival knowledge that had kept humans alive for millions of years. Morrison had resigned as chairman and publicly recommended Margaret as his replacement. She had declined, she had no interest in administrative work, but she had agreed to lead the new research initiative. David Chen was her co-director, and Sarah Kim had joined as their structural engineering consultant. On the wall behind the conference table was a new photograph, blown up to poster size. It showed a Neanderthal family group, reconstructed based on the latest research. They weren't brutish or stupid. They were human, their faces showing intelligence, compassion, and that same fierce determination to survive that Margaret had carried her whole life. "We're calling this the Ancient Wisdom Initiative," Margaret told the assembled researchers. "For too long, we've studied prehistoric humans as if they were primitive versions of us, less evolved, less intelligent, less capable. But the truth is, They possessed knowledge and skills that we've lost. They could predict weather patterns without instruments. They could read geological signs without sensors. They could navigate without GPS, heal without modern medicine, and survive catastrophes that would destroy us today. She clicked to the next slide, a map showing ancient human settlements and their survival rates through various natural disasters. Neanderthals lived through volcanic eruptions, ice ages, floods, and earthquakes, and they didn't just survive, they thrived. They adapted. They passed down knowledge through generations, not in books or computers, but through observation and teaching. That knowledge is still in us, buried under layers of technology dependence. Our goal is to rediscover it. An older researcher from Germany raised his hand. Professor Klaus Richter was 78, one of the few people in the room older than Margaret. Dr. Brennan, are you suggesting we should abandon modern technology? No, Margaret said firmly. I'm suggesting we should remember that technology is a tool, not a replacement for human cognition. The engineers who designed the Pacific Coast Convention Center used state-of-the-art technology, but they forgot to respect the geological forces that Neanderthals would have recognized immediately. We need both, the precision of modern science and the holistic observation skills of ancient humans. David stood up, pulling up another slide. We've identified 7 key areas of ancient survival knowledge that we believe can still be recovered and applied. Environmental prediction, disaster response, resource conservation, community resilience, adaptive problem-solving, intergenerational knowledge transfer, and sustainable living patterns. Dr. Brennan's earthquake prediction is an example of environmental prediction combined with disaster response. But how do we recover this knowledge? A young researcher from Brazil asked. Neanderthals are gone. There are no written records, Margaret smiled. We study what they left behind with new eyes. We experiment with their methods. We talk to indigenous peoples around the world who have maintained similar knowledge systems. We teach ourselves to observe the way they observed. She paused. And we test ourselves in real situations, just as they did. Professor Richter leaned forward. That last part concerns me. Are you proposing we deliberately put people in dangerous situations? I'm proposing we acknowledge that dangerous situations will continue to happen: earthquakes, floods, wildfires, storms. And when they do, people with ancient survival knowledge will be more likely to survive than people who only trust their phones and their computer models. Margaret's voice softened. 3,000 years ago, there was a massive volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean. The Minoan civilization, one of the most technologically advanced societies of its time, was destroyed. But in the same region, small groups of people survived: people who read the environmental signs, who trusted their observations, who moved to safety before the eruption. Those people became the ancestors of later Greek civilizations. The survivors weren't the most technologically advanced. They were the most observant. Sarah Kim added, "From an engineering perspective, Dr. Brennan is right. We've become so dependent on models and calculations that we've stopped doing basic observational checks." The hairline cracks she noticed in the convention center ceiling, they were visible to anyone who looked up. But no one was looking. We assumed the computer model had checked everything. "So we teach people to look up," said a middle-aged researcher from Japan. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had studied earthquake preparedness for 20 years. "In Japan, we've maintained some traditional earthquake warning signs: animal behavior, well water levels, unusual cloud formations. But each generation trusts them less. The young people laugh at the old ways. They trust their phones." "And when the phones stop working?" Margaret asked quietly. "When the power goes out, when the satellites fail, when the technology breaks down, what then?" The room fell silent. Margaret clicked to a final slide, a photograph of her father, standing in front of a coal mine, his face lined with experience and wisdom. "This is my father, Thomas Brennan. He died in 1989 when I was 37. He had an 8th grade education, and the academic world would have considered him uneducated. But he could predict weather 3 days out just by watching the sky. He could find water in the desert by watching where birds flew at dawn. He could tell you which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill you, not from books, but from knowledge passed down through generations of poor rural families who had to survive on observation alone." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "The last thing he said to me was, 'Margaret, don't let them make you forget that smart and educated aren't the same thing. The Neanderthals were smart. They just weren't educated in the way we count it.'" That's what this project is about. Recovering the intelligence that we've dismissed as primitive, the wisdom we've traded for technology, the survival skills we've forgotten in our rush to believe we're superior to everything that came before. Professor Richter stood slowly, his eyes bright. Dr. Brennan, in 1943, I was 8 years old, living in Berlin during the bombing raids. The air raid sirens often failed, but the old people in our neighborhood could tell when the planes were coming minutes before the sirens. They could hear changes in the normal sounds of the city, sense shifts in the air pressure. They saved many lives with that knowledge. But after the war, when we rebuilt with modern technology, that knowledge was dismissed as superstition. We called it old wives' tales. Now I wonder how many people died in later disasters because we forgot how to listen. Around the room, other researchers began sharing stories. The Brazilian researcher told of indigenous groups who predicted floods by watching ant behavior. The Japanese researcher described ancient tsunami warning systems based on stone markers and oral tradition. A woman from New Zealand talked about Maori navigators who could cross thousands of miles of ocean using star patterns, wave forms, and seabird movements, knowledge that modern GPS had made obsolete, but which could save lives when technology failed. Margaret listened to them all, feeling something shift in the room. This was what she had hoped for, a recognition that humanity's past was not something to be dismissed, but something to be understood and valued. David leaned over to whisper, "You did it, Dr. Brennan. You changed their minds." "No," Margaret whispered back. "The earthquake changed their minds. I just survived long enough to be here when they were ready to listen." 6 months after the earthquake, Margaret received a call from an unexpected source. The United States Geological Survey wanted to establish a program training emergency responders in ancient environmental observation techniques. The Federal Emergency Management Agency wanted her to consult on disaster preparedness protocols. Universities around the world were adding her papers to their required reading lists. And most surprisingly, a major documentary series wanted to feature her work, bringing ancient survival knowledge to millions of viewers. But the moment that mattered most came on a Tuesday afternoon in April 2026, when Margaret received a package from a small town in Pennsylvania, the town where her father had worked in the coal mines. Inside was a letter from the local high school. "Dear Dr. Brennan," it read, "we've been following your work since the earthquake. Our school is in a coal mining community, and many of our students come from families like yours, hardworking people whose knowledge is often dismissed because it wasn't learned in universities. We'd like to start a program teaching traditional survival and observation skills alongside modern science. Would you be willing to help us develop the curriculum? We'd like to call it the Thomas Brennan Survival Knowledge Program, in honor of your father." Margaret sat in her office, the letter shaking in her hands, and for the first time in 3 years she let herself cry, not from pain or frustration, but from joy. David found her like that 20 minutes later. He read the letter over her shoulder and smiled. "What are you going to tell them?" Margaret wiped her eyes and laughed. "I'm going to tell them, yes, and I'm going to tell them that they need to understand something important." "What's that?" "That their grandfathers and grandmothers, their parents who work with their hands, their neighbors who never went to college, they're not uneducated. They're differently educated. And in a world that's becoming more unstable, more unpredictable, and more dependent on technology that can fail at any moment, that different education might be exactly what saves us." She stood up, energized in a way she hadn't felt in years. "We need to expand the project. Not just research, but practical application. We need to train people young and old in these observation skills. Create a network of people who can read the signs, who can respond when technology fails, who can survive." David grinned. "The Neanderthal Survival Network?" "Exactly." Margaret pulled out her phone and started making a list. "We'll start with earthquake-prone regions, but expand to flood zones, tornado alleys, wildfire areas. We'll work with indigenous communities who have maintained these traditions. We'll document everything, but more importantly, we'll teach it, make it accessible, make it normal again to trust your observations, to pay attention to the world around you." "The modern world won't like it," David warned. "They'll say you're spreading superstition, anti-science sentiment." "Then they're not listening," Margaret said firmly. "This isn't anti-science. This is the science that kept humans alive for 3 million years before we invented instruments to do the observing for us. It's the foundation that all our modern science is built on. We just forgot that the foundation matters." Over the next year, the Neanderthal Survival Project grew beyond anything Margaret had imagined. The documentary series reached 20 million viewers in its first month. Schools across the country began incorporating basic environmental observation into their science curricula. Emergency response teams added traditional knowledge specialists to their rosters. And slowly, gradually, people began to look up again, to pay attention, to trust their senses and observations alongside their technology. Margaret gave lectures around the world, but her favorite appearances were always at small schools in working-class communities, places like the town where her father had mined coal, places where people still remembered how to read the sky and trust their instincts. At one such school in West Virginia, a 10th grader raised her hand during the Q&A session. "Dr. Brennan, my grandpa says he can tell when it's going to rain by how his joints feel. Is that real science or just an old story?" Margaret smiled. "Your grandfather's joints are responding to changes in barometric pressure that occur before precipitation. He's not imagining it, he's a human barometer. That's absolutely real science. The question is, does he understand why it works or does he just trust the pattern?" "He just knows it works," the girl said. "He doesn't know the science part." "Then you have an opportunity," Margaret told her. "You can learn the modern scientific explanation and he can teach you the practical observation. Together, you'll understand both the mechanism and the application. That's how knowledge evolves, not by abandoning what worked before, but by understanding it more deeply." The girl beamed. "Can I bring him to meet you?" "I'd be honored," Margaret said. Later that day, the girl returned with her grandfather, a man in his 70s who walked with a cane and had hands gnarled from decades of manual labor. He approached Margaret shyly. "Dr. Brennan," he said, "I never thought I'd meet someone from a university who didn't think people like me were stupid." Margaret took his hand gently. "People like you, people who work with their hands, who observe the world directly, who trust experience over theory, you're the inheritors of 3 million years of human survival knowledge. The universities forgot that for a while, but we're remembering now." The man's eyes filled with tears. "My whole life, people made me feel like I didn't matter because I didn't have an education." "You have an education," Margaret said firmly. "It's just not written in books. It's written in experience, observation, and survival. That's the oldest and most important education humans ever developed. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't matter." On October 7, 2027, exactly 2 years after the earthquake that had changed everything, Margaret stood once again in a conference center. This one selected for its geological stability and traditional building methods that incorporated ancient engineering principles alongside modern safety standards. The second annual Neanderthal Survival Symposium brought together over 5,000 researchers, emergency responders, educators, and community knowledge keepers from around the world. The keynote speaker was Professor Klaus Richter, now 80 years old, presenting his research on traditional European disaster prediction methods. But before the formal program began, there was a special ceremony. Morrison, who had spent the past 2 years working to rebuild his reputation by promoting ancient knowledge preservation, walked onto the stage. Next to him was a woman in her 40s, flanked by 2 teenage children. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison said, his voice carrying none of its old arrogance, "2 years ago, Dr. Margaret Brennan saved 2,000 lives, including mine, by trusting knowledge that our field had dismissed as primitive and unscientific. Today, we want to honor not just her, but the source of that knowledge." He gestured to the woman and her children. "This is Linda Brennan Foster, Dr. Brennan's niece. With her are her children, Thomas and Marie, named for their great-grandfather Thomas Brennan, a coal miner who passed down generations of survival knowledge to his daughter, which ultimately saved all of us." Margaret stood up, surprised, as Linda and the children approached her. "Aunt Margaret," Linda said, tears streaming down her face, "my whole life I was ashamed of where we came from. Ashamed that Grandpa Thomas was just a coal miner, that we were poor, that we didn't have the education that people respected. But watching what you've built, understanding what Grandpa's knowledge meant, I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm proud. And I want my children to be proud too." She turned to her children. "Thomas Marie, your great-great-grandfather might not have gone to college, but his knowledge saved thousands of lives. That matters more than any degree." Young Thomas, who was 16, spoke up. "Dr. Brennan, I want to study ancient survival knowledge. I want to make sure people don't forget again." Margaret looked at her great-nephew, named for her father, carrying forward the family legacy, and felt the weight of 75 years of life settle into something like peace. "Then I'll teach you everything I know," she said, "and together we'll make sure that the wisdom of people like your great-great-grandfather is never dismissed as primitive again." The audience rose in a standing ovation, but Margaret wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the photograph on the screen behind the stage, her father, Thomas Brennan, standing in front of that coal mine in 1975, his face weathered and wise. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. "We made them understand." That evening, as the symposium wound down, Margaret found herself on the conference center's outdoor terrace, looking up at the stars. David and Sarah joined her, along with Professor Richter and several other colleagues who had become friends over the past 2 years. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked. "Navigation," Margaret said. "Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens navigated by the stars for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew the sky intimately. Now we have GPS, and most people couldn't find north by the stars if their lives depended on it." "But they could learn," young Thomas said, having followed them outside. "Right, it's not too late to remember." Margaret smiled at him. "It's never too late to remember. That's the beautiful thing about human knowledge. It doesn't really disappear. It just goes dormant, waiting for someone to wake it up again." "Like Neanderthal DNA," Thomas said excitedly. "We learned in school that most humans have some Neanderthal DNA. It's been there all along, just waiting for us to discover it." "Exactly like that," Margaret said. "The Neanderthals didn't really die out. They became part of us, and their knowledge didn't die out either. It's in how we navigate cities without thinking, how we read faces and emotions, how we instinctively know when something feels wrong even when we can't explain why. We just forgot to value it." Professor Richter spoke up, his voice soft in the darkness. "When I was a child in Berlin, my grandmother used to say that the modern world was making us blind. She meant it literally, that by staring at books and papers and later televisions, we had stopped looking at the real world around us. I thought she was just old-fashioned, but she was right. We became blind to what our ancestors could see clearly." "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked. "We've started to remember, started to value ancient knowledge again. But how do we make sure it doesn't get forgotten again in another generation?" Margaret thought about that. Around her, the night sky sparkled with stars that her Neanderthal ancestors had used for navigation 50,000 years ago. Below in the city, millions of people moved through their lives guided by phones and GPS, unaware of the celestial map above them. "We make it part of education," she said finally. "Not separate from modern science, but integrated with it. We teach children to use GPS and to navigate by stars. We teach them to trust weather forecasts and to read the sky. We teach them that human intelligence isn't about choosing between ancient and modern, it's about using both." David nodded. "The Neanderthal survival curriculum. We've been developing it for schools, but maybe it needs to be broader. Maybe every person should learn these basic skills the way we learn to read and write." "Yes," Margaret said, "basic human survival literacy, not because we expect modern technology to fail, but because understanding how to survive without it makes us better at surviving with it. It makes us more observant, more connected to our environment, more capable." Thomas was looking up at the stars, trying to identify constellations with an app on his phone. Margaret gently took the phone from him and pointed. "See those 3 stars in a row? That's Orion's belt. The 2 bright stars above are his shoulders, the 2 below are his feet. Once you see the pattern, you'll never forget it, and that pattern has guided humans for at least 40,000 years." Thomas stared up at the sky, seeing it properly for the first time. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "It is," Margaret agreed. "And it's yours, it's all of ours. The same sky that Neanderthals saw, the same stars that guided early Homo sapiens across continents. That knowledge, that connection, it's our birthright as humans. We just have to choose to claim it." 5 years after the earthquake, Margaret Brennan celebrated her 78th birthday. The Neanderthal Survival Project had expanded to 60 countries and had trained over 50,000 people in ancient observation and survival techniques. 3 major universities had established departments dedicated to traditional knowledge preservation. Emergency response protocols now routinely incorporated ancient environmental prediction methods alongside modern technology. But the change Margaret was most proud of was smaller, more personal. In her hometown in Pennsylvania, the high school had fully implemented the Thomas Brennan Survival Knowledge Program. Students learned physics by studying how ancient humans had built structures without modern tools. They learned biology by studying traditional medicine. They learned earth science by learning to predict weather using observation. And most importantly, they learned that different kinds of knowledge and intelligence were all valuable. The dropout rate had fallen by 60%. College admission rates had doubled. But more than statistics, the students had gained something intangible: pride in where they came from, confidence in their abilities, and a sense of connection to the long human story of survival and adaptation. Margaret visited the school every year on her birthday. This year, she arrived to find a surprise. The students had built a small outdoor classroom using ancient construction techniques they had learned in the program. At the center was a bronze plaque, the Thomas Brennan Memorial Observatory in honor of all those whose wisdom was dismissed and in celebration of knowledge reclaimed. Smart and educated aren't the same thing. Dedicated October 7, 2030, Margaret stood before the plaque, her hand pressed to her heart. Around her, students and teachers gathered, including Linda and her children, now young adults themselves. "Aunt Margaret," Linda said softly, "Dad would be so proud." "He already was," Margaret said. "He didn't need this to be proud of who he was, but I'm glad that others finally understand why he should have been valued while he was alive." Young Thomas, now 21 and studying anthropology at university, stepped forward. "Dr. Brennan, I've been researching Neanderthal symbolic behavior for my senior thesis. I found something I want to show you." He pulled up images on his laptop, photographs of ancient Neanderthal sites where researchers had recently discovered evidence of astronomical observation. Stones arranged to track solstices, cave paintings that might represent constellations. Evidence that suggested Neanderthals had not just survived, but had sought to understand their place in the cosmos. "They weren't just surviving," Thomas said excitedly. "They were thinking, questioning, trying to understand, just like we do." Margaret studied the images, feeling that familiar thrill of discovery that had driven her entire career. "Do you know what this means?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "It means that for at least 100,000 years, probably much longer, humans have been looking up at the stars and asking, why? That curiosity, that drive to understand, it's not new. It's not something modern humans invented. It's ancient. It's fundamental to what we are." She looked around at the gathered crowd, young and old, educated and self-taught, professors and manual laborers. That's the real lesson of Neanderthal survival. Not just that they had practical skills, but that they had curiosity, intelligence, and the ability to pass knowledge forward. They were us. We are them. And when we remember that, when we value all forms of human knowledge and intelligence, we become complete. Professor Richter, now 85 and using a wheelchair, rolled forward. "Dr. Brennan, Margaret, I have a confession to make. When you first presented your theories about Neanderthal intelligence 40 years ago, I thought you were a fool. I voted to reject your papers. I believed you were being emotional, sentimental, allowing your working-class background to cloud your scientific judgment." The crowd fell silent. "I was wrong," Richter continued, his voice breaking. "You weren't clouded by sentiment. You were clear-sighted in a way the rest of us weren't. You understood that dismissing ancient human intelligence was the same prejudice that dismissed your father's intelligence, that dismissed anyone who didn't fit the narrow definition of what the academic world considered valuable. And you were right. It took an earthquake and nearly 2,000 deaths to make us listen, but you were right." Margaret crossed to him and knelt beside his wheelchair, taking his frail hands in hers. "Klaus, we were all wrong, all of us. We were so busy fighting to make our work matter, to prove our theories, to gain recognition. We forgot that the work itself was about understanding our shared humanity. That's what I'm trying to remember now." David approached the microphone set up for the ceremony. "Dr. Brennan, the university has asked me to present you with something." He held up a framed document. "This is official recognition of your 45 years of research on Neanderthal cognitive abilities, and a formal apology from the academic community for dismissing work that has proven to be not just accurate, but essential to modern survival science. We were wrong to push you out. We were wrong to call your work romantically outdated. And we're sorry." Margaret accepted the frame, but she didn't look at it. She was looking at the faces around her, the students who would carry this knowledge forward, the teachers who had chosen to value different kinds of intelligence, the community that had learned to take pride in their history rather than shame. "Thank you," she said simply. "But the real recognition belongs to every person whose knowledge was dismissed, every grandparent whose wisdom was called superstition, every working person whose intelligence was undervalued because it wasn't certified by a degree. This isn't about me. It's about remembering that human knowledge comes in many forms and all of them matter." She turned to young Thomas. "Tell me about your thesis. What else have you discovered?" As the sun set over the Pennsylvania hills, Margaret sat with the students and listened to their research, their ideas, their dreams. They talked about ancient navigation techniques and modern GPS integration. They discussed traditional medicine and pharmaceutical development. They debated the balance between technological progress and environmental observation. And Margaret realized something profound. This was what her father had wanted for her all along. Not recognition or awards or academic respect, but this, the passing forward of knowledge, the connection between generations, the understanding that every human carries within them millions of years of survival wisdom. As the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had guided countless generations of humans before them, Margaret felt a peace that had eluded her for 78 years. The fight was over. The knowledge was preserved. The lessons had been learned, or rather, they had been remembered. Because that was the truth at the heart of everything. Humans had never really forgotten. The knowledge had always been there, dormant in instinct and observation, waiting for someone to recognize its value again. Sarah sat down beside her. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret smiled. "I'm thinking that my father was right. Smart and educated aren't the same thing, and I'm thinking that it took me 50 years to really understand what he meant. Which is that every human alive today is the descendant of survivors. We all carry within us the accumulated knowledge of 3 million years of humans who were smart enough, observant enough, and adaptable enough to survive everything the world threw at them. We might forget that knowledge, we might dismiss it or undervalue it, but it's always there waiting to be remembered. That's the true power of ancient humans, not that they were primitive versions of us, but that they were us, and we are them." David joined them, looking up at the emerging stars. "So what's next for the Neanderthal survival project?" Margaret thought about that. She was 78 years old. She wouldn't live forever, but the knowledge would. The project would. The understanding that ancient wisdom mattered just as much as modern science, that would continue. "Next," she said, "we make sure that 100 years from now, when people look back at this time, they don't say, 'Remember when we almost forgot everything our ancestors knew?' We make sure they say, 'This is when we remembered. This is when we chose to value all human intelligence, not just the kind that came with certificates and degrees. This is when we became complete." She stood up slowly, her joints protesting, her own barometer predicting rain that would come tomorrow, ancient knowledge written in her aging bones. "Come on," she said to the gathered crowd. "I'll teach you how to find north by the stars. It's a skill your ancestors had. It's a skill you need to reclaim." And as the night deepened and the stars brightened, 75 people, young and old, educated and self-taught, scientists and workers, stood together learning an ancient skill that had guided humans for hundreds of thousands of years. Margaret watched them find the North Star, watched their faces light up with understanding, watched knowledge pass forward one more time. And she thought about her father, about the Neanderthals, about all the humans who had survived long enough to make this moment possible. "Thank you," she whispered to the stars. "Thank you for surviving. Thank you for being smart enough to pass it forward. Thank you for making us possible." The stars, of course, didn't answer. But then again, they didn't need to. They had been answering for millions of years, for everyone wise enough to look up and listen. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.